Nice to have you sit down with us.
It's nice to be here,
And
Rich.
stuff. What was your first memory, or what you did to kind of get involved with secular humanists to formulate your own personal kind of ethics and values? What was the kind of your
Well,
first?
if you're going back, years ago, I don't think I was ever much of a believer. I'm just kind of a skeptical person by nature. Geez, I remember my sister when I was a little kid teaching me that old thing about starlight, star bright, first star you see tonight. And I really thought, man, is this possible? And I wished on the first star that I saw, and I didn't get it. So that was like, okay, I didn't get my wish. This supernatural stuff, maybe it's not really so
Well, you
great.
made the mistake, because usually the first thing you see in the sky is a planet, not actually a star.
Okay,
so maybe you're looking at the wrong thing.
I could try it again, but again, my skepticism's coming in here. And I was raised in a Jewish family, but very reform and very open to questioning. I remember when I was 13, my grandfather was dying, and I did the old prayer to God thing, and that didn't work either.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well,
Sorry.
we all know that that's part of life and everything, but I think when I was in college, it solidified for me when I was in college.
Yeah.
Because I was a history major, specifically 20th century European history. And I took a class that was a very interesting class. It was like a double class taught by a history professor and a psychology professor. And it was called The History and Psychology of Genocide. And it focused on the Holocaust.
That's a light subject to take in college, right?
Yeah, well, it was actually quite
Easy
fascinating
reading, right?
class,
It's like-
yes, but it was harrowing, yes.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. But that sort of solidified it for me. Okay, it's sort of like an Epicurean kind. I also took philosophy, and so I learned about Epicurus and.
Who was Epicurus? Just
Okay.
so the people.
Well,
can-
he was a philosopher. I don't have the exact quote, but basically what he said was something along, questioning the existence of God and saying, well, and looking at that from the standpoint of evil in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if can't God prevent the evil? Well, if he can't, it's not really a God, certainly not all powerful. Or can he prevent the evil but won't? Well, then he's malevolent. And and if he can't and he won't, then where does this God stuff come from?
Yeah.
So, looking at that in the context of the Holocaust for me was like looking at something like, this is unbelievable. I mean, the horrors are just so incredible. And no excuse was the mysterious ways thing wasn't going to. What was to me that just meant like mysterious. You mean like arbitrary and capricious, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I didn't really see the point of it all, but I thought that was sort of solidified it for me. I said, if this happened, there can't be some sort of deity who looks over us and makes sure everything's is nice and all. Either there was a God who couldn't prevent the Holocaust, like with Epicurus, then in what way is this a God?
Yeah.
Or a God that didn't want to. And then to my way of thinking, I thought, well, if I would like to have the guts to, the old, what will you say to God when when you die? And he says, why didn't you believe in me? And there's smoke all over the place and you're terrified and all the rest of that stuff. And I thought to myself, I would like to have the guts to say, screw you. Look what you allowed to happen. Screw you, and I don't care what you do to me.
Yeah.
That would be real courage. In fact, it's interesting.
So this is all happening in college.
In college,
what you're
yeah.
doing. So how would you describe yourself at that particular time as what your philosophy was?
Well, I would say I didn't believe, so I would call myself an atheist.
So you are an atheist.
Yes, I am an atheist. I mean, I don't like to pussyfoot around too much. I don't like to put in the 1/1000% chance kind of thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't suit my personality. So yeah, I'm an atheist.
Or are you a humanist?
Yes, absolutely.
And are you a secularist?
Yes, absolutely. I'm all of those things.
And you mentioned before that you're a skeptic too.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I tend to be I don't know if I'm officially a skeptic in the sense that I'm a member of the Secular Humanist Society. I'm not a member of the New York City Skeptics. But I just, generally speaking, regard myself as a fairly skeptical person. So you're going to tell me something, I'm going to look, okay, well, let's see if that's really true.
So speaking of arbitrary and capricious, you are the president of the Secular Humanist Society of New York. How did that happen?
My father was one of the plaintiffs in an important Supreme Court case that was called Engel versus Vitale, and it was the case in which the Supreme Court held that organized prayers in public school violated the Establishment Clause of the Constitution.
So Engel was your dad.
It was my father, yeah.
And who was Vitale?
The superintendent of schools of the Herrick schools.
Which school
The
district?
Herrick School District on the North Shore of Nassau County on Long Island.
Was Madeline Murray O'Hare involved in any of this?
Not in our case, no.
Okay, she was involved in other cases.
In other cases, yes, but not in our case.
And your case decided exactly what?
That organized...
Or your dad's case was?
Well, organized prayer in public school was a violation of the Constitution. What had happened was the school district in the mid-1950s, the state of New York decided that they were going to bring together a bunch of clergymen to write what they would call a non-sectarian prayer.
Is this like a joke where you're a Jew, a priest,
yes,
and a Protestant goes into a bar, and what do they come out with?
And a bureaucrat. You got to throw in a bureaucrat, go into a bar. And they came out with this prayer. I hope they had a better time, drinking than they did prayer creating. It was very innocuous in its own way. It was sort of like Almighty God. It starts with Almighty God. Okay, so already you're talking about it's monotheistic. So when they say, oh, it's non-sectarian, well, there are religions that are not monotheistic. So it's, so is Almighty God, put your grace on our parents, our school, our country, etc. It was very much a product of the Cold War and the times of the 1950s, where to be, we were, the American people, we really wanted to separate ourselves from the Russians, from Soviets. We were better than they were.
Atheists.
They were atheists. So we had to be conspicuously religious. That's what, and so putting in the prayer, this was about the same time in the mid-1950s that they added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, that they put in God we trust on our paper money. So it was a lot of that was in reaction to the communism. And so this was, we should all pray together, everybody, because, that conformity, it really argued for conformity in a lot of ways, of that we are all in this together against the Red Menace. And we all are, one of the things that distinguishes us from the Soviets is that we are God-fearing. I'll get back to that in a minute, because I always thought that was a very weird phrase. Why would you be afraid of this all-loving and wonderful God? It doesn't make any sense, but none of it does, so what the heck?
We love you, but you got to be afraid.
Right, but you got to be afraid. He loves you, but you better be terrified of him. It was all that, we're the God-fearing, etc. So the state of New York wrote this prayer, and it was actually optional among schools. You didn't have to do it. If you were going to do a prayer, if a school district was going to do a prayer in the state of New York, they had to do that one. But they didn't have to do a prayer.
Yeah.
But in the district where my family lived, which was the Herrick School District in New Hyde Park, in the North Shore of Nassau County on Long Island, they decided to do it.
So your dad was in school at that time? Was that
no, my older brother was in school at the time.
Oh, so your dad was the plaintiff for
Right.
For your brother?
For my brother. Yeah, right. So, because the case was brought in 1958, which is the year I was born. Mm-hmm. But my brother was born in 1951. So he was 7 years old in 1958 and already in school when the case was brought. You needed to have that in order to have standing.
Standing, yeah.
Right.
So you grew up in this family where this particular case was well known.
Yes.
And stuff. Did you have any repercussions of that?
There were tremendous repercussions when the case first was decided, when the first case was first brought, and when it was decided.
Did it affect your brother in school?
Oh yes, very much. He is still much more reticent to talk about it than I am.
Yeah.
But yeah, in fact, and when it first happened, when the case was first brought, I'll tell you, an effect on me, this may be my earliest memory, or one of my earliest memories. I was 5 years old, and it was about, I don't know, probably about 9 months after the case had been decided. And I woke up in the middle of the night. You know, one of our co-plaintiffs was our next door neighbor.
Yes.
The Roth family, Larry Roth and his family. In fact, in some ways, Larry was more of the impetus of the case than my father was.
Yes.
But I heard sirens, and I saw flashing lights, and so I, woke up, and the window of my bedroom was right next to, these are not, these are small plots,
Yes.
so you're pretty close to the house next door.
Yep.
And so what had happened was that some local people had burned a cross on Larry Roth's driveway. And that was one of the first earliest memories that I had. But
How did you feel about that? I mean,
well, I didn't
you were
really
5.
understand it that much at the
Yeah.
time because I was only 5. But I know from talking to my father, et cetera, that through that time there was all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the threatening letters, the threatening phone calls. These Jews ought to go back to where they came from.
Yeah.
Geez, why does that sound familiar? Anyway,
Seems very resident.
Yes, resonant today.
So
my
your dad-
my father at one point got a phone call at his office in work.
Yeah.
We've got your kids.
Yeah.
So it was some pretty serious.
How did your father think about this as he got older?
He always felt mixed about it.
Yes.
I mean, he knew he was doing the right thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about it that he knew he was doing the right thing, and I think there was a certain pride in doing the right thing, but he also knew it was very difficult on,
Yeah.
especially my older brother.
Yeah.
I'll tell you an interesting thing. While the case was pending, the prayers went on, and my father had to make a decision with my brother, because technically he could get up and walk out. You didn't. Oh, yeah, that was the thing. It was voluntary. And I'll tell you what, one of the dissents from the New York State Court of Appeals before the case went to the United States Supreme Court said, well, you're calling it voluntary, but these are little children. There's always going to be pressure on them to conform.
Yeah.
And so my father told my brother, stay in the class, just mouth whatever you want to mouth. And he didn't think that was right. It's not that he thought that was sort of any way the right thing to do.
Yeah.
He was afraid for my brother.
Yeah.
And I could tell you, Larry Roth told his 2 sons, who were a little older than my brother and were in the same school, to leave, and they suffered serious social, ostracism, threats, sometimes attacks, things
Oh,
like
really?
that. Yeah, well, yeah.
Physical
They got
violence?
beaten up a few times, yeah.
Wow.
And so it was a very difficult circumstance, but I know my father felt as the years went on, he knows that he did the right thing. And I think he was certain pride and glad that he did it, but he also felt a little, maybe I should have just kept my head down.
Yeah.
Because I know my brother felt kind of scarred by it for a long time.
Yeah.
And was, kind of a little bit upset by it. The idea that, that why did you do this? You put me in the middle of, whatever. And that, I think, weighed on my father for a long time.
And you've seen in the news every once in a while that they're trying to attempt some other way to be able to get prayer back into school some particular way or another and stuff. And how do you feel about when you see it? Do you just think that's do you think that we have to still keep being vigilant for this?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. In 2 ways. I mean, first of all, from a purely legal way, you have to keep being vigilant because there are attempts to overturn, the case. But the other way that you have to keep being vigilant, the other reason is because people, like you said, they go around it. I mean, you hear about this stuff all the time. It frequently centers around athletics. Like, the coach leads the football team in prayer, afterwards. And thank you, Lord, that none of us had our necks broken this particular day. Although the long-term effects, but we don't have to go into that.
Yeah.
But also remember,
a lot of people don't know that we still receive people saying letters that their son has to do that.
Oh yeah. There are people who are upset about it, but Remember, there are organizations that'll provide legal representation for people who want to sue under the situation like that. In fact, it was the American Civil Liberties Union that provided my father and Larry Roth and the co-plaintiffs with a lawyer. His name was William Butler. But somebody has to have standing. So if prayers that violate the tenets of Engel versus Vitale and other court cases are being conducted in public schools, and the ACLU or the Freedom from Religion Foundation or Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, if they find out about it, they will provide legal representation for people, but somebody whose kid is in that school is gonna have to take the very difficult and very stressful step of saying, this is wrong, because the suit's gonna be in their name. Yep. It's not gonna be in the name of ACLU or one of these other organizations.
Yep.
It's gonna be in their name. And that takes a lot of guts.
So how do you speak to that, to the child or the parents that have to do that they want to do the same thing that your father did, do the right thing.
Right.
But how do you speak to them about why it's important to step up and be a part of that?
Well, because it's not going to get stopped unless somebody does. And they wouldn't be talking to people like me or somebody else about it if they didn't know that it was wrong.
Yeah.
And they didn't believe that it was wrong. And someone has to step up. But, I would never, really push or anything, because I know, listen, this is not easy. This is not hard. I wouldn't want to push anybody into doing something that they felt uncomfortable with. And of course, you're going to feel somewhat uncomfortable regardless.
So if you look, let's say 20, 30, 50 years in the future, or maybe 100 years in the future and stuff, how do you think that we'll view what happens now versus then? Do you think we'll still be fighting these same battles then? Or do you think that there's an ethical, humanist, secular viewpoint that can speak to that we can promote and provide in the future?
Yeah, I think that's the hope.
That's one of the things you're doing?
I can't predict, of course, but that's the hope. I think for a lot of people in the secular humanist society and in other secular groups, I think that's part of the hope, that there will be education and there will be an understanding. I mean, there's a couple of different things. First of all, I think it's easier to just say, hey, look, I need you to respect my rights, whether you believe or not. And then, of course, I think most seculars, certainly I do, I'm a very strong believer in the First Amendment. So I believe people have the right to their freedom of religion, including me.
And the First Amendment is exactly what?
First Amendment with regard to religion, is made up of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So the Establishment Clause says that the government shall not establish religion, and the Free Exercise Clause says, nor shall it prohibit the free exercise of religion.
So is it free exercise?
So it's the free exercise.
School?
No. Free exercise is not, none of the rights in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are absolute. It's our religion. Human sacrifice is what we do. Come on, it's my religion. I'm allowed to do this. Not really. No, you're not.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is nobody ever stops anybody, really. And this is something that's very much part of the struggle of our current times, is that people are trying to say, if I can't force you and other people to at least pay some sort of obeisance to my religion, then you're not allowing me to practice it. And I'm like, no, that's not it. You don't get it. That's not the way it is. You can practice your religion. Certainly you can practice your religion. You just can't force it on me.
And some people would view that as saying, well, I want to have the freedom to practice my religion and practice my way.
You do have your freedom to practice your religion. And people do have their freedom to practice their religion
to themselves
and in church and in their homes and etc.
And
But public
like-minded or
schools are
whatever.
public schools. And there are also, there are a lot of religious schools. You can send your kid to religious school.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to stop you from doing that. And you can certainly go to church. And you can certainly...
So what's the switch? The switch is when it affects somebody else.
Right. The switches is when it affects somebody else. And being honest about it too. It's voluntary. You can always get up and walk out. That was the case.
Yeah.
But again, that dissent from the Court of Appeals in the state of New York said, looked at it from a more realistic perspective.
Yeah.
Which is that there's, when you're talking about little kids, there's going to be a tremendous pressure on them to conform. And if that's what everybody else is doing, it's going to be pressure on them. And then their rights and my rights as a parent are being violated.
So if you were going to look at a humanistic or secular or your own personal viewpoint on the world and stuff, you would say this is the principle which guides me through this argument in government. What would that be? What would be something that people would say, I'm a humanist for this reason and that's why it leads me to take this stance?
That's an interesting question. I would say that as a humanist, I value every person. I think every person has value, and every person has to have their rights, considered, etc. The rights. Remember, the Constitution does not exist to protect the rights of the majority, and people confuse that sometimes. I say, well, everybody wants this. Why shouldn't it be that way? Mm-hmm. And the answer is because people, even that one person, has constitutional rights. And I'll tell you a story. I was in high school, and I had a history teacher who I liked very much. His name was Bob Zini. I liked him very much. He was a really good guy. And, I've always, this is going to sound funny, but I've always liked Christmas. I like the trees, and I like the lights, and I like all that sort of thing. And
who doesn't like Christmas?
Right. So, so some friends of mine, most of them I don't think were Jewish, but didn't really matter. They say, hey, why don't we, get a tree and put it in the courtyard of the, and decorate it and stuff like that. And I said, well, that seems harmless enough. And I was talking to this guy about it, and he said to me, John, if there's one person in this school, one person who sees that, and it makes them feel that they are not part of this school, that this is not their school, then it's wrong and it shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And I thought about it and I said, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
So the ethical value or the humanist value is that you're free to express yourself, but if you infringe upon somebody else,
Right.
and religious people say, well, those things infringe upon my sensibilities in terms of how I feel.
And
about
yet
something.
I walk past all these churches and synagogues and mosques, and I don't think that they would accept too well the opposite argument that, oh, well, I have to see that church, do something to cover it up because it offends my sensibilities. That's not my religion. Yeah. That offends my sensibilities. Yeah. And I don't think that would be too well accepted. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thing. I always laugh about this. It's a joke, but it makes sense too, is that, I'm not an expert on religion by any stretch of the imagination, but I've learned a little bit here and there through the years. You can't help it. My understanding is that most people who are religious, certainly of the, primary religions that are practiced in this country and around the world, believe that prayer does not have to be out loud to be heard. Mm-hmm. And the joke about that is that as long as schools keep giving math tests, there will always be prayer in school. And it's a joke, but I think it makes an important point too, which is nobody's stopping anybody from praying to themselves. You can't get in somebody's head. I wouldn't want to be able to get in somebody's head. Yeah. That, if you want to say a prayer to yourself at any time over the course of a day, anywhere you are, nobody's going to stop you.
It's the same thing with the phrase about no atheists in foxholes.
Well, which is not true, by the way.
It's certainly not true.
It's really not true.
But the saying goes to the point where it's accepted but in the reality, it's not. And I think that when we look at the humanist side of all this and stuff, we have things that people say and takes as regular axioms of our life and going forward. But then again, as a humanist, we look at it and say, okay, how do we view those things?
Right.
And how do we tell the rest of the world? So if you were going to tell, let's say, the future generation, as a humanist, how would they view that? And we talked a little bit before about that, but how would you tell them to view these things that are happening in our culture and in our times, and why is it a benefit to everybody in the future to have a more humanist viewpoint on this?
Well, I think one of the things about humanism is that we believe problems of society at large, or maybe even individual problems, wherever you go to, but that should be solved or looked at using logic, using reason, using research, and not using dogma. And I think what I would say to them is that you will find, I do believe, and this is my personal experience, but I believe it's true, you will find that using reason and logic and the knowledge base and the scientific method will go further for you in solving problems, and will go further in society for solving problems than in not using, in rejecting humanism and just expecting somebody to, something, some entity is going to take care of everything. So this entity is not going to take care of everything. I look at that with regard to climate change. You think about climate change. How are we going to solve the problems of climate change? Well, we're going to have to look at the science and find out what we can do and take, deliberate action. But there are people, listen, there are plenty of people, there are people who are in high positions in government in our country who literally believe that there's no need to do anything about the dangers and perils of climate change, because in 50 years or so, Jesus is going to come down and there'll be the apocalypse, and all that stuff won't matter anymore. So why should we bother planning for it?
Or they would believe that God's going to take care of it anyway.
Right.
God's going to
some
fix
way
it.
or other. Human beings cannot destroy God's creations.
Yeah.
And tell that to all the animals that are extinct.
Yeah.
By human hand, by human means.
I think I'm an animal. Maybe I'm going to be extinct.
Well, listen, I always say that, that over 99% of every species that have ever existed on this planet are extinct.
Yeah.
And someday human beings most likely will join them, but we will be the only ones who deserve it.
Yeah.
Because we will be the only ones who did it to ourselves.
And speaking to the future about that, and you mentioned that humanism is a way to be able to take an actionable and steps toward making a better future, and that you can you do that through action. You do it through understanding and action and stuff. How do you think of that as a secular humanist and stuff to promote and to talk about these values to the future and stuff? How do you see your role in how that may happen, and how we can keep promoting that in the future?
Well, I think one of the things that we can all do, and this is something that's, again, none of this is easy, but something that we can all do, all humanists can do, is to be open about our beliefs. And to, first of all, it's hard to look at a person that you know and you think, this is a pretty good guy,
Yeah.
As some sort of horrible monster when you find out that, oh my God, you're an atheist. And that word is so loaded, it's really funny.
Yeah.
There are ways to deal with that too, to lighten it up a little bit, is say, well, you don't believe in God? Oh, I don't believe in gods. Gods? Wait a minute, there's only one. Oh yeah, whose God is the only one? I'm just curious. Oh, well, mine. I said, well, that's not really true. There are lots of gods.
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion, he says, well, everybody's an atheist. It's just that, people like me take their atheism one God further. They're atheists about every God that's ever existed on this planet, ever been believed in, or not really existed, but ever really been believed in on this planet, and all there are now. They're atheists as regard to all of them, except for one. So I just take my atheism one God further than they do.
So Zeus and
Right, of course.
and Thor and
Right.
Mithra
And the other way,
Vishnu, and-
language matters. It really does. The way
Yeah.
you say things matters. And another thing I'll say is, well, I don't believe in the supernatural. And I can't tell you how many people who believe in God will immediately say to me, oh, I don't either.
Yeah.
You don't. You think that there is this entity, alien entity, that violates all laws of nature, that is everywhere, hears everything, knows everything, is all powerful, is immortal, but you don't believe in the supernatural. You want to tell me where a being like that exists in nature?
yeah.
It doesn't,
Well,
so it's supernatural.
It occurred to me that there might be a difference between supernatural and supranatural. That if it's outside of nature, that's supranatural,
Right.
and then if it's supernature or nature on steroids,
Right,
so to
right.
speak, that God just knows all the ways to manipulate and work through nature and stuff. It's interesting that I've never really gotten a good understanding of what that or what any of those gods are. Or is it supra or super?
Right, yeah, it's like
and
probably
stuff?
some sort of combination thereof.
Yeah.
But the thing is, unlike humanists, people who, generally speaking, people who believe in such things, they're not going to look through it that closely.
Yeah.
Part of what many people who are religious say is that, you're looking at it too. You have to just sort of, I don't know, like a leaf on the stream, just
Yeah.
sort of go. And I said, well, that's great for leaves, but I don't think that's good for people, and that's not good for any thinking being to just say, okay, well, I'll just believe that, and just wherever it carries me, it carries me. To me, it's like if you're a thinking, sentient being, you're going to want to have some direction over your own life and believe that to a certain extent you're in control of it. Of course, we're not all in control of everything. I mean, about our lives. I mean, you can contract an illness or something like that, and you're really not in control in that sort of way. But you can be in control of your thoughts.
It's all not determined for
Right. It's not. It's not determined for you. There are certain decisions you're going to be able to make, and those are your decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I always, say, well, I prayed over this. And the result was, what were you told?
Yeah.
I mean, you were told something. I mean, it's very interesting. The I could get in trouble for this, but the line between religious belief and psychosis is not that broad. I mean, you really believe that somebody's talking to you? I mean, when someone says they have voices in their head, we give them antipsychotic medication, right?
Yes.
Well, but if they say that voice was God, we still give them antipsychotic medication, because I wonder how many people really believe it. I mean, really, truly believe in the tenets of religious belief. I think there's quite a few people who sort of, there's a lot of societal pressure. You will have an easier time in our society if you go to church, Christmas, maybe Easter, or you go to temple on the high holy days or something like that, and you belong, and you go, and you sort of go through the motions, and you're part of that particular community. And I think there's a lot of people whose belief is in that sort of way. They like it. I know my mother likes to, my mother's not a believer, but she likes to go to temple because she likes the music.
Yeah.
She sort of she likes the sort of ceremony and stuff like that. I have never been a good temple goer. To me, first of all, I had to wear a shirt and a tie, and then immediately that was okay. But I was never a good temple goer, and I have always. I have this tendency to sort of out of the side of my mouth make wise ass statements, because I am by nature a wise ass.
Yeah.
And boy, if there was ever a target for wise assism, it's religion.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
this
as a
is ridiculous.
humanist, you take or you're secular, you're atheist, your ethics of life, and you go and you say, I'm going to make fun of that. How do you marry those two ideas of saying I want to be nice to people, but I'm also sarcastic, or I'm wise ass to somebody else? How do you
with great difficulty. That's really, yeah, with great difficulty, because, I hold my tongue often, and there's a lot of things I want to say that I don't, but sometimes I do. I don't like discomforting people.
Yeah.
I really don't. I don't like discomforting people. I don't like making them, as a personal matter, but as an intellectual matter,
Yeah.
I love discomforting people.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what else I like as an intellectual matter. I like it when people discomfort me.
Yeah.
Because that's how you think. That's how you learn. That's you get something, it's like, wait a minute, this isn't what I used to believe. Because beliefs are easy. Beliefs, you have them and then you just tuck them in your pocket and there you go, and that's what they are. And you don't really necessarily have to think about them too much. But then when someone comes along and challenges your belief, that's the nature of intellectual life.
Test your mettle.
Well, there's also, and also be willing to say, and that's a large part of humanism, because that's part of this. That's the scientific method, writ large. Is if you convince me, you give me evidence, and I'm convinced, I'm going to be open to receiving that evidence. I'm going to listen to what you say and be open to receiving that evidence. And if it changes my mind, it changes my mind.
That's one of the tenets of humanism.
Yes, absolutely.
Is to look at evidence and make a decision based off of that evidence, and be able to change our mind when we have new information.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Being open to that, and it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing for anybody, but it's something that as a humanist, I try to keep reminding myself of.
Well, there's people out there that would take and see, let's say, political, for examples, and maybe we'll talk about a little bit about business and stuff. They look at something and say, well, I got to make a decision. Am I going to ignore it? Am I going to take some arbitrary or some kind of stance on this? Or do I look at it more fully? Do I spend my time, effort, and energy to look at it? If you have something like a Woody Allen movie, do I love his movies? Do I not love his movies? Do I look at the evidence against Woody Allen in terms of his own personal life? What he's done, or do I take his art separately from his life? And as a humanist, how are you navigating these things, whether they're in business and art or government, and saying, do I give up? Do I take it as is? Do I say that, hey, there may be a balance, or do I have to spend my time, effort, and energy in all these things to make a decision? How does a humanist make that?
I think, as unsatisfying as it feels for me, the only answer I could say to that is on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
I look at each one and try to come to a decision and try to do it within the framework of not only reason and logic, but of wanting to be a decent human being. I mean, I want to be fair, to everybody, but there can be situations where you can't be fair to everybody. I mean, I'm going to make a decision, on the one hand, you have Mia Farrow's daughter, who claims that she was abused, and her brother, Ronan Farrow, backs her up, but then another brother says, I don't think that happened. And, sometimes you just take the best you can get. And I'm aware in the Woody Allen situation that the case was investigated, pretty thoroughly by the local district attorney, and that they had used professionals from the Yale Child Studies Center to speak with at the time, the young girl, and their belief was that the abuse didn't occur. I mean, and so there were no charges brought, etc. So in that situation, I can say, well, I haven't seen myself the kind of proof. We all make these kinds of decisions on things without the full information, because I can't go to sit in everybody's trial. Yeah. I mean, you read what you read in the newspapers, and you just sort of do the best you can with it. And I know that what I started out, I said it doesn't feel that satisfactory, and it still doesn't feel that satisfactory, but there are some things that's just the way it goes.
So how would a humanist navigate all this stuff? How do they look at that? I mean,
well, first of all, you look at evidence.
Yeah.
And I think to be aware of our prejudices is important. If you're walking down the street and you see, coming the other way are some, African-American teenagers, and you feel a little nervous or something, at least at the very mindsets have the wherewithal, the knowledge of what's going on, the self-awareness to say, hey, why do I feel that way? What is it about these guys? Is it just because they're black? If they had been white, teenagers walking down the street in the same way, dressed similarly, would I feel the same way?
Yeah.
You know, I think that's, you know, that's part of us all coming to greater awareness of our own, because it's hard to, you know, you grow up in this society and you think you're not like, you know, you're not influenced by race or gender or sexual orientation or something, and it's like, you know, come on, give me a break, you know, I mean.
Well, we also see in the news that there are instances that are happening in culture where people are saying, I don't want to ever hear from that person ever again. They're a murderer, they're a child rapist, they're a misogynist, and they cancel that person out. Lock, stock, and barrel, that person is no good.
Right.
And as a humanist, that's an interesting way of trying to look at the world, but a humanist, I think, would have some problem with it.
Yeah, I think so, because things are a lot more complicated than that. I mean, human beings are more complicated than that. Stories are more complicated than that, and we like black and white.
Okay, I'm looking at this person, but in the story, he molested people. You know, we want nothing to do with that person. That person should be fired. That person should go away. The punishment should be extreme, and that sets a message for the future and stuff. You know, that's part of that rationale that is going on. And as a humanist, it's
well, you know, I chuckle a little bit when he said this, because today I was writing an essay. Human beings weren't ready for the internet and social media. And I sort of try to make the point, but it's, you know, kind of a serious point that
are any of us ready
we're not.
for it?
We're not. Yeah, there are certain things that certain advances in technology that human beings have not been ready for, and will not be ready for. And I think people are too. I hate to say this. Well, but it's what I think, so I might as well say it. I think that there are too many people who are too ignorant and malevolent to be able to handle social media in a responsible way.
So another aspect of humanism, I think, or you can speak to it a little bit, is about relying on experts and saying, okay, I'm not, I don't want to give up on this subject, or I don't want to ignore it. I don't have the time, effort, and energy to understand it, or whatever. And that there are experts, let's say in media, that understand the courts, and they're interpreting what happens, or in, let's say, climate. You know, there are people that understand the climate that are saying that we're really in a bad situation and we need to make some changes for it, and I have to rely on them. I can't be a climate scientist, I can't be a botanist, I can't be an oceanographer, but I read and I see and I hear from a lot of these people, and they're saying something's got to change.
Well, you know, we can't all be a surgeon or an airline pilot either, and yet we rely on their expertise, and we have no problem relying on their expertise. We understand that these are people who have studied the subject, you know, for quite a long time, and they've, you know, have experience in the subject, etc. And you're right, we have to rely on the experts. I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't look at things with our own critical eye, but we also look at things with the knowledge of not only of what we know, but of what we don't know. So that I can say, you know, I don't know this, but, you know, the expert consensus seems to be this. There's nothing wrong with expertise, you know. I mean, in fact, it's a very, very good thing. You know, I know my wife is a school teacher, and she's always, you know, grinding her teeth. I mean, she has a master's degree in special education and a PhD in educational psychology, and she's like, people think that anybody can just walk into a classroom and teach. And, you know, you can't. I remember a number of years ago when Jon Stewart was the host of The Daily Show, he was doing a segment on a congressional hearing in which people were talking about I know better how to educate my child, whatever. And, he showed the film clip and it came back to him and he was saying, what's going to happen next? People are going to be going up there and saying, what they're going to have a hearing on airline safety and say, people are going to be saying, I know better how to transport my own children through the air than some pointy-headed pilot knows. I mean, we all rely on experts. We just don't think about it all the time. But you're going to fly a plane. You're relying on a lot of experts. You're relying on the experts who are flying the plane, the expert air traffic controllers. You're relying on the expert maintenance people and the mechanics who keep the plane in good order. And you just get on the plane and you don't. Well, I don't really think about that. But yeah. these are people who are experts in their field. And I'm happy that they exist, that they're there. But this is what we look at that. We can make our own decisions, but it's important for us to know what we know as individuals and also what we don't know.
Yeah, and as a humanist, we look toward the future, and we're going to need more experts.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The more expertise is good. I mean, that's a good thing. And it's funny because the word elite has been twisted and turned and whatever. It is now an epithet, right? Oh, he's an elite. He's an East Coast elite. Oh my God, that's the worst. I don't know if it's worse than a West Coast elite, but when President Obama decided to go forward with the raid to kill or capture, wound up killing Osama bin Laden, they called on this elite Navy SEAL team. And what are they going to do? Walk into an army base and say, give me your most average guys, because we don't really like the elites. They think they're so special. They think they know so much, which they do.
Or I could go kill them myself.
Right. Or something like, give me your most mediocre soldiers here to send on this. No, of course not. We want the best. That's what we want in terms of the minds who are looking at something like climate change, is that, I want to listen to the people who really study this and really know this, because you're right. I'm not a scientist. I think myself is pretty knowledgeable, but not at that kind of level. But I also, I mix in my own thinking as well. I guess it was in 2006 that the movie An Inconvenient Truth was released, and I saw it at the time, and I'm find myself very frequently thinking back to the movie, because the people who were the experts in that movie and were telling us what was going to happen, it's happening. I mean, being right is a pretty good piece of evidence that you know what you're talking about. And they're right.
But you have some people that are disagreeing with that. They're saying that what was promoted in that movie and stuff is not happening. And you have some people that are saying, like you, that it is happening. This is proof.
Well, it's funny. Some people,
were right.
There are people who say anything.
Yeah.
I mean, look, if you're going to rely on, people are saying, which is, who's that guy again who always says people are saying how great he is? I think okay, that guy.
I'm familiar with that guy.
You're familiar with that guy. People say anything. Yeah. I mean, if that's what you're going to be based on, people are saying, well, who are these people? What are their qualifications?
Yeah.
What are, and I understand that there are some people with academic credentials who deny climate change, but there's so few, as opposed to the people with the credentials who affirm that, yes, this is happening and it's a tremendous danger to the future of civilization. I don't know the science myself, but if 99% of scientists are saying, yeah, this is the case, I do know that of the warmest years in recorded history, I don't know the exact number, but it's 12 out of the 15 most warmest years since we've been recording that sort of thing have been in the last 15 years. So that kind of data I can look at and I can see.
Yeah. And in terms of, we've been talking public policy and what people believe, so we were talking about government. What about business? Is there a humanist ethical value that can be applied to business and to?
Yeah,
is there an ethical way to run a business?
I can't remember what it was called, but there's corporations who believe that part of their mission is the public good. I mean, it depends on, you want to have a long-term look at things, and you can make, a lot of money in the short term, but if you're doing it on fossil fuels that are going to destroy the earth, the people who front for the fossil fuel industry, and especially people, elected officials who do so, their opposition to taking action against climate change has changed over the years. I mean, at first it was, this isn't happening, then it's happening, but it's not caused by human beings, then it's happening and maybe it's caused by human beings, but it would cost too much.
Yeah.
It would cost too much to our economy. You're going to wreck the economy by doing the things you want to do. And, my reply to that was, well, what's going to happen to the economy when the city of Miami is underwater?
Yeah.
When the city of New Orleans is underwater? How's that going to affect the economy? How is it affecting the economy now when hurricanes are stronger than they used to be? And flooding is worse than it used to be. And here, billions and billions and billions of dollars get rich quick. But I think there's a real part in government for that, too. After the recession in 2008 happened, Alan Greenspan was called to Congress and asked to testify. He said something that, really blew my mind, because what he was asked about this, the greed of Wall Street that, helped to precipitate this horrible economic condition. And he said, I never thought that people would put their own selfish interests ahead of the good of their company and the country as a whole. And I said, boy, this guy's got a PhD in economics, but evidently he didn't take Psych 101.
Yeah.
I never thought that people would be greedy. I never, and this is Alan Greenspan, for crying out loud. Look around the people in your social circle, sir. I never thought that people would be too greedy to, and it's like, well, if that's that being the case, that's the, I think part of the big argument for having a capitalist system, because nothing else seems to really work, but that it has to be regulated for the common good. Because there will be some people who in their business dealings will be thinking about the common good and keep that in mind. There certainly are.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who won't. And
so as a humanist and secularist and atheist, and looking at a pro-scientist or science way of looking at the future of business, what's that approach that people should
I think part of that, again, is the use of reason, logic, and the scientific method in what you're doing.
How's that compared to someone's self-interest and how they look at their self-interest? Or some people are,
again,
you were talking about the human nature as being very specific.
How people define their own self-interest.
Yeah.
I think
is there a humanist way of looking at that?
You will be a happier person if you contribute to the happiness of the rest of the world. I don't know about anybody else, but I don't have an easy time stepping over homeless people. Now, maybe some people do. But remember, Henry Ford, who was not a humanist by a lot of stretches, and a lot of things about him were a bad guy, but he raised the wages of his workers, like in the 1920s, way higher than any other car company. Why did he do it? It wasn't necessarily because he was such a wonderful human being. It was because he thought, it was enlightened self-interest. Because he said, the people who make my cars have to be able to afford to buy them. Mm-hmm. Or we're just not going to have enough people buying cars, and it's not, and the company's not going to work, and et cetera. So I don't think he was a great humanist. I don't think he was trying to raise up these people out of poverty and stuff like that. But ultimately it was that. But it was his own self-interest in an enlightened way. And I think to look at it in that way, to look at the long term, the picture. But a lot of people won't.
It was a way to sell a lot of cars because he needed people to be able to afford to buy them.
Yeah, be able to afford to buy them, including his own workers.
Yeah.
And so you look at it that way, and you may say, well, it's going to cost me a lot of money to do a environmentally responsible cleanup of the crap that I've been throwing into rivers and the air and stuff like that. But on the other hand, if I look at it from an enlightened self-interest point of view, ultimately, I need to breathe that air. I need my customers to be able to drink that water. I need my workers to be not sick so that they show up. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of the way to persuade that to do things in a socially responsible manner in business is, in the big picture, in your own self-interest.
Well, you mentioned enlightened self-interest.
Right.
How did you describe that particular terminology?
I think, again, I think it's looking at the big picture. In enlightened self-interest, it's realizing that the self-interest of every person in the planet is tied up with the self-interest of every other person. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a large part of humanism, understanding that the good of ourselves and the good of the well-being of ourselves and the well-being of our families and the well-being of our communities is tied up all in the well-being of each other and the well-being of every person. And I think that's a humanist way of approaching the future, so that we have a future that we can all, everybody can live in. Because this, well, you know, it's as long as I got mine stuff, that can work for a short period of time, mm-hmm. but in the long run, that's not going to work. That's not going to work for the happiness of not only everybody else, but the happiness of you, Mr. Individual, as well.
Yeah, greed is good is gone.
Right. Well, you know,
it doesn't last over time.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't last over time. What should wind up happening is the recession of 2007, 2008, et cetera, because it's just like, you know, grab, and I don't care, and this is what's good for me. I think it might have been a better thing if some of the people who did that had suffered more of the consequences for it.
Yeah.
Because I think that would also help people to understand that this was not in their own self-interest.
Yeah.
You know, when the guy, you know, pockets the money, you know, we're so obsessed with money and success, and you know, take that money and put it in my pocket. Now I'm rich, and so, you know, I didn't go to jail. And
well, isn't that kind of a libertarian viewpoint? Is that if they're doing something, that they are going to suffer those consequences, so therefore they're not going to do those things.
Well, yeah, but you know, the thing is, you have to be consistent with
Yeah.
that sort of thing, with the sort of libertarian thing, you know, et cetera. You know, there are people who talk about the libertarian viewpoint that people should be free to do whatever they want, et cetera. And he would talk about companies. If a company puts out a product that is dangerous, mm-hmm. and someone is hurt by that product, well, they can sue the company. You know, and why we shouldn't regulate that company, because that should be the regulation, that the company is going to go out of business, they're going to lose money, et cetera. In theory, that makes some sense, but in practice, it frequently doesn't, because it's not consistent. You know, the same people who would say we shouldn't regulate business would also say that, but we should put a cap on torts, on tort law, on injury law, because, you know, oh, it's bad for business, people get all this money. Say, wait a minute, if you're for a free market, that jury that's going to award this guy $10 million or $12 million, whatever it is, that's part of the free market too. That would be, but in my view, that is a still unsatisfactory ending, because if someone puts out a product that hurts or kills, you know, someone that I'm close to, no amount of money is going to make up for that. And, you know, maybe it'll change their ways, but we will still have lost somebody, mm-hmm. Because we didn't. So enlightened self-interest is a good idea with regard to business, but I still think we still have to keep an eye on people, because not everybody's going to follow it. I mean,
well, and I think there's also these circumstances where if you're a libertarian, you can say, oh, somebody can sue a company, but we know that lawyers can countersue.
Yeah, and we also know that with the bankruptcy laws,
and it costs people,
you know,
to
the
do
same
that.
guy. You know, I form a corporation, and you know, I'm making good money, and I'm paying myself a nice big salary out of that corporation every year, and then our product, you know, hurts a lot of people, and so the corporation gets sued. I don't get sued personally.
Yeah.
And that money, all that salary I took out, that's still mine.
Yeah.
And the corporation gets sued, and the corporation can just say, well, we don't have the money to pay all of that stuff. You know, we've been paying out good salaries to the owner. So we're just going to go bankrupt.
So how does a humanist look at that? I mean, if you have a situation, let's say, like Monsanto, that they go out and they have soybean strain, and they go out and they suspect a farmer that's doing, that's somehow there's genetics of their soybean in this other farm, which it could be blown over, it could be residue. they for any reason they can go to that guy and say, we're going to sue you. Well, he's a little farmer. How is he going to afford to have a big time lawyer to defend them against this? And it's going to cost him all this money to be able to have a lawyer and fight that suit and stuff. And so they give up.
Well,
and as a humanist, we're looking at these things where you were talking about how a company can go out of business and people don't have repercussions for that. How does a humanist look at all these things that are going on and saying, how do we make sense of this? How do we make this better?
I think that it's got to be a combination. Yes, we can try to convince people of their enlightened self-interest, but at the same token, we need government regulation. We need, because the government is the representative of the people.
Yeah.
And, someone has to be looking out for the people. And hopefully, I mean, there are responsible corporations, and hopefully, although, you're going to be best off with an understanding when you're looking at corporate actions and corporate activities that they are out to make money. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're called for-profit corporations for a reason, that they are out to make money. And, if you say, well, that's okay. I mean, again, we have a capitalist system here. I'm not an anti-capitalist. I mean, I don't think it's great, but I just don't. They say that nobody's come up with anything better. Mm-hmm. I think it was Winston Churchill, but I'm not sure. That it's a lousy system, but nobody's come up with anything better.
Yeah.
And so we have to, at the same time that we give people freedom and allow them to be entrepreneurs and et cetera, that there are also certain rules that we apply as well with regard to the safety of products. And I think that's the role for government in terms of we the people. You want to persuade people, I'd always rather persuade people to do the right thing, but some people aren't going to be persuaded, and in that case it's like, well, okay, you're going to go to prison if you don't do the right thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. That's important too. Okay.
All right, so I want to say thank you very much.
My pleasure.
As a humanist that's running a very prominent New York secular humanist organization in New York City, I want to say thank you for spending your time, effort, and energy as being president.
I find it rewarding. And
I think it's important.
I like it. I like connecting to people, and I think what we do is important.
Yeah.
I really do. I think what we do is important.
It's like back
for
to
society.
Your dad, right?
Right,
You're doing
back
something
to my
important,
dad,
but it's got its
difficulties, but it's important. And at the end of the day, that's part of what life is about. Sometimes people who are religious will say to me, "Well, what's your purpose in life?" And it's like, well, basically to make myself a better person and to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
In the tiny little increments that I can do it, and that's a purpose. And I don't need to be religious or believe in God in order to feel that that's my purpose, and that's pretty much everybody's purpose, I think.
And I want to say thank you for your help, effort, and energy, and also for being here today to talk to us.
It was actually a lot of fun.